All right. Welcome, everybody. My name is Hannah New, and I'm the marketing manager for the University of Utah Press. Welcome to our virtual book launch on Misplacing Ogden, Utah, Race, Class, Immigration, and the Construction of Urban Reputations. Feel free to type your questions in the chat function at any time. This is being recorded and it will be up on the YouTube channel soon. I'd like to introduce our participants. First is Pepper Glass, the author of the book. He's an associate professor of sociology at Weber State University in Ogden, Utah. He has published his research on racial inequality, social movements, and youth culture in ethnic and racial studies, mobilization, and the Journal of Contemporary Ethnography.
Hello.
Sorry?
Oh, I just said hello.
Okay. Our next participant is Adrian Gillespie Andrews, Assistant Vice President for Diversity and Chief Diversity Officer at Weber State University. She serves on the Utah Governor's Martin Luther King Jr. Human Rights Commission, the Ogden Diversity Commission, and champions diversity, equality, and inclusion efforts every day. Val Holley is an independent historian in New York City. He won the Utah Book Award for nonfiction for 25th Street Confidential, Drama, Decadence, and Dissipation Among Ogden's Rowdiest Road. Dr. Krista Paulsen is an associate professor of urban studies in Boise State's University School of Public Service, where she studies continuity and change in regions, cities, and neighborhoods. Andrew Deener is a professor of sociology at the University of Connecticut and the author of 2 books, Venice, A Contested Bohemia in Los Angeles, and The Problem with Feeding Cities. Now I would like to have Pepper take over.
All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for coming, and I'm so happy to have this panel here. I'm honored to have them at least meeting in the same virtual place. And although this is a unique setup, it also gives the opportunity to get people from across the country, right? So which we have from the panel. We have, what is it, Idaho, Connecticut, and Val, where are you? I don't even know.
New York.
Okay, in New York. So we have both the east and west sides represented here. So how I'm going to start is giving you a little overview, hopefully short, of the main points of the book and what it's about, followed by I'm going to turn things over to the panelists to speak a little bit, and then we're going to do a Q&A, and hopefully I got that all right, Hannah, there. So okay. So basically, my research on Ogden started when I moved to Ogden, and that was 9 years ago. I'd moved from Los Angeles, and it was really interesting. I started hearing this interesting thing of people talking about Ogden in this negative way, and especially parts of Ogden, like, oh, be careful of these neighborhoods. And it really kind of jarred me, because I'd drive around those places and be like, this doesn't look, that I don't see any problem with this. This looks kind of, maybe a little working class, but kind of a quaint little neighborhood. Looks fairly nice. But people in the local area often had these very negative reactions to the city. So I decided to research this and see what the perceptions of Ogden were among people. And also kind of how they happened and why they happened. And so my question was kind of, the wider research question was, how do we make these divisions between good and bad places? How do we separate what we'd call good neighborhoods from bad neighborhoods, from ghettos, from inner city, or whatever terms you have? There are multiple terms for that. Okay, and so what I started to do is collect interviews from residents, and did this while they were traveling around the city to various neighborhoods. These were kind of identifiable neighborhoods that residents knew in the area, and so and so trying to find my findings. And what I really discovered is that a very different picture from what you'll see in the research literature, but also kind of in people's common sense thinking about these things, about perceptions, because we tend to see perceptions of cities through what I called internal disorder, which is that places are bad because they have bad conditions. They have features that are negative, that are turning people off. So this would be anything from crime, drugs, gangs, homelessness, graffiti, dilapidated buildings, etc. And that's what makes a place bad, that people see that and say, oh, this is a bad area. And when they don't see that, they see, you know, things that are conditions that are more favorable, maybe, they will say, oh, this is a good place. Okay, but I said, argued not so much, and I'm going to explain that a little bit in the coming minutes. That I argued that these are not divisions of disorder, but divisions of what I called moral frontiers. These divisions between good and bad are divisions between good and bad people, and people who are higher status tend to want to distance themselves from people who are lower status. And by the way, this is an old kind of sociology idea of divisions between people and classes, race, gender, etc., and issues of power. And so higher status people are dividing themselves, and that's how it works. It's not about the features of the place at all. It's how people who are outside of those places, often with little experience with them, will define these places as bad there. Okay, so what I found was a big division between what I called insiders and outsiders. The people, insiders being the residents of Ogden, and outsiders being people in the surrounding area. And what you see is insiders love the city. They went on and on, I like Ogden, you know, this is my place, this is great. But they talk constantly about outsiders, the non-residents, saying, oh, they think of Ogden as a bad place and they think negatively. It's just not, you know, they kind of contest that there. So, but then I found another division, which was among the residents themselves. There were kind of two groups of people emerged in my data. And this was really surprising because I mean, I thought there'd be differences, but not in the way that they came about. And so one group you had were I called them native residents, which were people who grew up in the United States. And it basically is a catch-all for everyone who's not an immigrant or a Latino immigrant specifically there, because they saw the city. They would say, oh, those people outside, they see Ogden as really bad. But then they would say, but you know what's really bad is this middle part of the city, like, or the western end of the city. Don't go there. Be careful. There are a lot of drugs and gangs there. You know, they kind of mirror the same thing that outsiders said, and they complained about outsiders said, but talking about the certain areas, the west side of Ogden. Okay, and they even had a very specific division through what they called the Harrison Divide. And if you don't know, Harrison Boulevard is this major street in Ogden that runs north and south. And they said everything east of Harrison is good. That's great. That's where you want to live. They were impressed if you lived there. But everything to the west is the bad area of Ogden. Okay. And so that's the native view. Then you had the immigrant Latinos, and this group was really interesting in that kind of in what they didn't do. And they didn't do a lot of the things that natives do. They didn't really talk about the reputation of Ogden and try to defend the city against it, that kind of thing. They barely mentioned it. They also didn't divide the city into good and bad halves. They talked about parts, you know, they were well aware of different areas of the city and things, but they didn't say, oh, there's a Harrison Divide, and this is a big division between good and bad, okay? So what I argue is, as I said, this moral frontier, that these are levels of status. So you have outsiders who are kind of the highest status people, and they say, you know, this is the bad place. We're going to separate ourselves from it. We're not going to go there. We're going to warn people about going there. And there's story after story about this. I gave lots of evidence from not just the interviews themselves, but from kind of local papers and things like that of people from the area saying, oh, this is a bad place there. And so you get this, and then you have the kind of middle status people who are the native residents, the insiders of Ogden who are not the immigrants, and they are kind of stuck in between, right? They'll defend the city and try to unite with the outsiders and say, oh, you know, we want to be like these people. We're not like they say we are. You know, we're like them. We're good and upstanding people. But at the same time, they turn around and say, but there are these bad people in the middle of the city and, you know, these bad areas, and we need to distance ourselves from them. And then you have the lowest status people, the immigrants, who were, you know, they didn't make any of these divisions. And I argue that's partly because just Latino immigrants are a very marginalized, kind of vilified population who don't really have many people under them who are less kind of status that they can say, oh, we're not like those people. And so instead they try to unite. You know, they say, oh, we're part of Ogden. They don't make these divisions and boundaries, these moral frontiers between people. Okay, so and to kind of close this out, I want to talk a few minutes about why this is important. You know, this isn't just kind of well, you know, we found these interesting things and people see things a different way. This has real world effects, and the two big ones I found is one that the internal disorder, this idea that the conditions of a place make it bad. The logical kind of idea that comes out of that is like, oh, you can clean up the reputation of people, of places by, or people too, the people who live there, by improving the conditions of a place. You know, you can have these crackdowns on crime. We can give people tickets for littering or graffiti, you know, and have these really harsh crimes for people, you know, kids tagging on the street, getting felonies, things like that. And these kind of broken windows, stop and frisk policies all come out of that kind of idea of oh, if we clean up the disorder in a place, it'll make it better. Okay, and as I argue, reputations aren't really about that places don't become bad because of the conditions there. And so trying to kind of crack down on people and put your boot down on the people who are already the poorest and the most struggling people in the community usually is counteractive. That's going to make things worse. That's making more divisions and boundaries. Okay. The second problem is kind of maybe more of a theoretical one, that this idea of internal disorder ultimately blames the victim. It says that people who live in these areas are creating their own reputation, right? That when there are gangs and crime, who is doing that, right? It's not people from outside who come in, it's generally the residents, right? I mean, they're obviously influenced by structures around them, you know, economic deprivation and the like, but they're the ones creating the disorder, right? It's not usually outside people. And so when you say, oh, the bad reputation is based on disorder, you're in a way, it's arguing that this is a creation of the residents themselves. And what I show is kind of an inversion of that argument, that no, these reputations come out of not the people in these places, but the people in surrounding areas and the outsiders who will define these places. And again, often they have little or no information about this. They are, you know, I open the preface of the book by talking about my experience growing up near East St. Louis and how people just said, stay away from there, don't go near there at all, you know, that kind of thing. And so I would never, you know, have thought of stepping foot into East St. Louis growing up, or even as I got older, and the idea that they're kind of taught this and they learn it and promote this idea that these are places that you should avoid. And this is even with little or no experience in those places. Okay, so that's my I think I did 10 minutes or so there. Okay, who's up on the panel? I don't know. Anyone itching to jump in?
We could just go in order and pass it on to Adrian.
Okay.
Well, okay, happy to accept the ball. And first, I would just like to congratulate Dr. Glass on this new book and the research from it. It was particularly personally impactful as I'm reading the text to hear my grandfather's voice, James Gillespie Sr., being quoted in the text. That was just a really nice gift. Thank you. As I was reading this book, something that really stood out to me because of the work I do around diversity, equity, and inclusion, was this hidden sense of assumptions that get made and attached to the reputation of spaces and places and people, and how it doesn't have to be explicitly stated. And so as I'm reading through the text, I'm thinking about how internal folks are saying, you know, this place it's a good place. I mean, we've got our problems, but it's pretty good. But they're not like the other people in this category of people. And that just resonates with me because I hear, you know, I grew up in Utah hearing, well, you're not like other Black people I know. And so it's that component of Ogden surprising people. And well, Ogden's sort of, I'm having this experience here where it's not like the other Ogdens I know, right? Except for that one part of Ogden over here, which is maybe questionable or scary, or I feel unsafe. And so this sense of internal disorder sort of got transcribed or imprinted on skin for me. And by meaning individually, there's not a lot you can do about how people are going to see you until they really see you. And so the sense of somebody who's an immigrant in Ogden, living, working, playing, having a life, saying this is a really good place. You know, yeah, there's all kinds of diversity, but they don't articulate the division the way folks who have the history of the place do. And that's sort of what we deal with race and identity. When people encounter diversity, they don't see the problems that are historically entrenched in a place or history. And so challenging the reputation becomes the struggle. So if I go back to my example, the comment of you're not like other Black people, then the question becomes, well, tell me about the other Black people you know. So Ogden's not like, you know, Central Ogden is not like Watts, California, right? Well, tell me what you know about Watts, California and the comparison that you're making here. And the reality is most times people can't. They can't make that comparison only from this abstract notion of what they believe Watts is like, or what they believe a ghetto is like, or what they would believe a Hispanic Latinx immigrant is like. And so the reputation becomes so distorted by the assumption and the perception of somebody else's reality. I just think, Pepper, you did such a great job of helping me see this in the text in a way that I hadn't thought about it. And that the way that reputation fundamentally, you know, fundamentally, we have to work as a larger group to transform what it means. But even then, within our own groups, we do the damage of creating this, as you call it, moral frontier. And that moral frontier for me is all about something or somebody always has to be better than something or someone else. And so we want to be relative in action, and we always want to be on the better side of that relative action.
Thank you. Val, I'm going to pass it over to you.
I'm Val Holley. I was born and reared in Ogden, and I just want to spend a couple of minutes talking about historical underpinnings of Ogden's reputation in Utah history. A lot of what has happened to Ogden's reputation can be traced to the coming of the railroad in 1869. Before the railroad reached Utah, there was a question as to whether it would go around the north side of the Great Salt Lake or the south side. If it went along the south side, it would come through Salt Lake, and that is what was expected. Brigham Young told a large meeting that if the railroad did not come through Salt Lake, it would be an insult to the people of Utah. The engineers of the railroads realized that it would take a lot less work, and in fact, the route was shorter if they went around the north side of the lake, but they withheld that information from Utah and Brigham Young as long as they could. Well, the upshot is that Salt Lake basically never got over it. It was always the junction city, Ogden, jockeying with Salt Lake, the capital city. I'm going to give just a couple of examples of how Salt Lake began to denigrate Ogden after that. Finally, in 1886, the railroads began to construct Union Station to fulfill a promise that they had made years before. However, when cost estimates ballooned, construction on Union Station stopped, and rumors flew in Salt Lake that the reason it stopped is that the railroads did not want to go through Ogden anymore. They wanted to come through Salt Lake, and they started making scathing derision of Ogden in the papers. And the upshot of that is, and I've never seen this in writing, but right after that, the Ogden Chamber of Commerce was formed. And I think that Ogden realized that it couldn't just take this lying down. They had to organize and fight to preserve their status as the junction city. Then in 1902, the Southern Pacific announced it was going to build a trestle across the Great Salt Lake, which would shorten the route by 43 miles to the coast and save a lot of expense. And Salt Lake, once again, didn't like that at all. They wanted the railroad to come through Salt Lake, and they opposed the building of the trestle across the Great Salt Lake. They claimed it was going to obstruct navigation on the lake. Ogden responded by saying, we can have balloons float over the lake instead, and Salt Lake will furnish the hot air to inflate them. Ogden had a holiday. They actually had a public holiday when construction on this Lucin cutoff, as it was called, began. And the school children carried banners responding derisively to Salt Lake and their wish for the railroad to go south through Salt Lake. So these are just a couple of examples of how jealousy over the railroad caused Salt Lake to to speak derisively and negatively of Ogden. There were a lot of other examples, but these will do for now.
Great, thank you, Val. I'm going to hand it over to Krista Paulsen.
Great, thank you. So first of all, I also want to congratulate Pepper on this book because there was just so much to like here. And I really want to thank him for taking up the question of reputation. There is just not enough in our literature to help us really understand the reputations of places, even though each of us, I'm sure, can come up with dozens of reputations we associate with places such as cities or neighborhoods, and some of those may be esteemed and some of those may be disreputable, but they are very much the way we organize our thinking about places, particularly places that we haven't been or haven't experienced firsthand. But we don't have a lot of good scholarship about how these are produced, particularly through everyday actions, those actions at the micro level that are detailed so well in this book, such as things like how people talk about places and how they move through them, the places they go to and the places that they avoid. That said, we know that reputations are very durable and they are real in their consequences, of course, so that makes them truly real and truly important, particularly as places and cities vie with one another for different kinds of resources, such as new migrants and investment and so on. So For a long time, I lived in Jacksonville, Florida, which is a place that shares with Ogden a kind of a negative reputation and a degree of what Pepper had called collective forgetfulness about its past. And it strikes me that these negative reputations are somewhat befuddling to the boosters and the growth coalitions who might otherwise really be successful in singing places' praises. And I think that's a really interesting dimension of reputation, is that leaders recognize their importance, but don't know what to do next, right? So for instance, in Jacksonville, once in a while, there'd be a suggestion to really embrace what is authentically Jacksonville. So for instance, it is like the cradle of Southern rock, but no one really got behind that image. And instead, you would have these hollow slogans or really kind of generic public spaces. And in Ogden, you know, you see this official desire to kind of grasp at a vision of Ogden that's sort of affluent and outdoorsy, and it just seems doomed to fail in comparison to places like Park City that are better at that. But the thing that Ogden is good at in terms of its diversity and even its notoriety can't be embraced by a set of leaders who seem more wedded to a potentially narrow and outdated version of what makes a place successful and attractive. So I think that was really interesting and really compelling. I also really appreciated the attention to the relationship between power and privilege and place. And indeed, in what we know about place reputation, much of that really stems from how we understand affluent places and their desires to preserve their reputations, often through political actions like exclusionary zoning or blocking affordable housing or something like that. But the relationship between those political processes and their impacts and place reputation is often really assumed, and it's not exactly interrogated. So by interrogating these processes, that's a really important contribution of this work. The other thing about that power dynamic that I think is really important is that in this book, we see how it is that elite places also maintain their reputations through what Pepper calls residents' demeaning and avoiding of disreputable places, right? So in labeling other people's places as unsafe or sketchy or as armpits, right? High status groups elevate their own places and they elevate themselves while they simultaneously affirm privilege that's associated with race and class, right? And so we have known for a long time that there's a hierarchy of places out there that is distinguished by things like different levels of resources that have to do with property taxes, for instance. But this hierarchy of places we now see is also something that's constructed culturally and routinely as we see these routine and unquestioned assertions from outsiders, right? As well as the apologetic acknowledgments and excuses made by native populations, and that those actions and articulations, they bolster the status of places that are not Ogden, right? As well as bolstering the status of the places within Ogden that are often whitest and most affluent. So again, going back to those other dimensions of power. So there's a lot else to really enjoy about this work. For instance, I really loved the parts about the entrepreneurial women and people of color, the different perceptions of what a busy street or an empty street means to different folks. So thank you for that level of detail. It was a really enjoyable book.
Oh, thank you. Andrew Deener, I'm gonna turn it back to you.
So also, just also thank you for inviting me, and congratulations to Pepper for this really great book. It's a very enjoyable book to read. I have to say, like it's a book that it's written wonderfully, but also it's about a place I didn't know very much about, and so for me, there are all these kind of insights about a region of the US that we often don't get to read about in sociology. And so I thought I would just point out a couple themes that resonated with me and maybe raise a couple questions. And so, the book kind of on the surface seems like it's asking a very simple question, right? Like, which is, what is the meaning of Ogden? Or more precisely, what's the meaning of Ogden for whom? And Pepper does this wonderful job of tracing out the complexity of where this moral value comes from and how it actually becomes part of the place. And so certainly there are concerns for like the economic value, right? Like it's hard to kind of move away from that when you're studying place, right? Because places are so embedded with economic value, right? The ability to brand places and turn reputations into material outcomes. But Pepper really shows in a lot of vivid detail that it's not simply about economics, right? And so I read the book in some ways as like reconciling this difference between symbolic and material value. And so there's social and cultural differences that get mapped onto and into the physical landscape, right? Like what kinds of commerce and retail are in which neighborhoods and what kinds of industry. At one point, I think Pepper writes something along the lines of Ogden was historically where I think he says that the slaughterhouse, the garbage, and other quote unquote unpleasantries were put. And right, and so it's kind of like this balance between the material and the symbolic, but these shape, as Pepper shows, the interaction dynamics, the group formations, who settles in which neighborhoods, who's in contact with whom, and of course how people view people with whom they're in contact with, and also those they're never in contact with, just simply by where they live in relation to others. And so in this way, Ogden configures people, right? Like it configures Mormons and non-Mormons, Latinos, African Americans and whites, native-born and immigrants. But it also challenges people, which I think Pepper really pushes for towards the end of the book, as people push up against each other to kind of transcend those boundaries. And even in some cases come together for the sake and love of place, the meaning of place. And so much of the book is about this, right? Trying to understand the work to create, sustain, and transcend moral boundaries. And Pepper writes a lot about what he calls a social constructivist perspective. He comes from this tradition of kind of thinking about the idea that people are constructing the world and reputations that they build on and make sense of in their surroundings. And so I'm going to push back a little bit, maybe, and maybe Pepper will disagree with me here, that this project also has a very substantial structural aspect to it. That when you're looking at multiple sides of a community, which he does, all the different interests and groups, historically and in the present, and that it's those relations that actually help us to conceptualize reputation, or the rise of a distinct place mythology, right? Not any particular individuals or group or micro neighborhood within a community, but it's the configuration and the relations between them that reinforce the narratives and myths. And these dynamics are so embedded in the composition of place that Pepper even talks about different levels of reputation, right? So in the introduction, he says that for every Chicago, and I really like this, for every Chicago, Las Vegas, or New York City that's evaluated on the world stage, there are dozens of places like Ogden with little reputation beyond the regional level. I mean, that to me signifies something very important and also kind of missing from our discussions of place in the US. We're so enamored by these kind of like big places that we kind of forget that most people don't live in them, right? Like that's not where the US is cultural dynamics is shaped, right? There are these social and spatial structures, and that when a place is not in the network of national and international conversations, that it's actually these regional and local structures that shape the dynamics of place. And so as I was thinking about what's the meaning of Ogden, I was thinking about it from the history of urban studies, right? So Ogden's an industrial boomtown trying to redefine itself. And in turn, it has residents trying to define themselves in that context. And in this way, it's like a lot of small cities in the US. there's something about the distinctiveness of these kinds of places and their overlooked spot. And especially during this moment in history where there's a huge pushback on globalization and cosmopolitanism, where the most famous cities, New York or San Francisco, are beyond unaffordable. The Ogdens of America are growing in symbolic importance, right? So agricultural and rural communities have consistently declined. Farming is almost non-existent as a type of work in the US. There's some manufacturing towns left, but the US is mostly post-industrial in the sense that most places have had to figure out ways to convert their local economies since the 1970s. And so when we think of New York or Chicago or LA or Vegas, we think financial industries, entertainment, tech companies, consumption, and a contrast between the college educated and those without a college education who are forced into service work or other kinds of low wage work without stable benefits, right? And so Ogden and many places like Ogden stand out with a mostly working class sector employed in local economy, construction economy, and others. And every city kind of has its support structure, whether it's the service class, the care workers, the construction workers, and small cities in particular are struggling with how to fit into a much different kind of economic system than the US had previously, or really any time before the 1970s. And so there's really this interesting questions that Pepper's raising about where morality and space fit into a place like Ogden in this particular moment in history. And so like, if you think about it in relationship to the history of urban sociology, for example, you know, you have your studies of Chicago in the 1920s that they talk about the moral zones of European immigration and Western religions. In the 1950s, you have your community studies of mass society and local community, the sweeping societal changes altering what people value in the world. What are their morals in relationship to where they live? In the 1960s, it was Herbert Gans's influential book, Levittowners, right, which was a classic on morality and community in a new white suburb. And then the studies following William Julius Wilson on hypersegregation and stigmatization, the kind of moral valuation of Black communities. And then the 1980s, 90s on gentrification and raising new questions about diversity and equality in the city. And so for me as an urban sociologist, it's interesting to think with Ogden, right? Like what time and moment and type of place is it? If Chicago neighborhoods were the emblem of morality and place in sociology in 1920, Levittown was the emblem in the 1960s, where does Ogden fit in? And what are some other places that are like it? Are they mostly places sociologists forget about? Are they in Utah? Are they in South Carolina, in Alabama? And in some ways, I'm kind of asking, is this a call for studying places beyond the most obvious ones, the LAs and the New Yorks? And so for me, like this all goes back to this one question, which is what is the meaning of Ogden, right? And I think the real answer probably depends on who's trying to answer the question and for what purpose, right? And I think Pepper really kind of taps into that kind of framework as well.
Pepper, do you have a response to that?
Wow. Where to start? Well, I guess, yeah, I think I totally agree that the idea of Ogden versus kind of the big cities that you think of and are often studied for their reputations is really important. That kind of we focus, kind of urban studies in general focuses on these big outliers, right? These you know, these places that are really not like other places, right? And that's why people go there. Tourists go to New York City or Los Angeles or Paris, you know, because they aren't like anywhere else. But then we see that as generalizable, and I think that is a problem that urban studies needs to kind of confront more. And unfortunately, I kind of came across this idea kind of late in the stage of developing the manuscript or I would have kind of talked more about it, but yeah, that's really important. And I guess also to address your question about the kind of structural versus cultural idea that how is this based on meanings or about material conditions? Yeah, I really struggle with this throughout because I think I started with, a very constructionist idea that oh, conditions don't matter at all. And then I was like, I'm going to get myself in trouble with that, and kind of was like, started to talk. But I think I do, there's all kinds of structures in that, the structures of people, at least, if not places, that the structural position of the immigrant Latinos is very different from the more affluent Mormons communities that live outside of Ogden, right? And that shapes people's perception. It kind of goes back to the old idea of ideology and how interests are formed from your position, that your ideas come out of who you are, not just, oh, that's my personal opinion kind of idea. And so, yeah, I'm still struggling with this idea of it. I'm not sure if I've reconciled it even now, but kind of where the culture and the structure ends, and how those fit together there.
Great. We actually have quite a few questions, and I'd like to get through as many of those as possible. First, there's a couple in the group chat. For Pepper, how do you counter the views of Ogden that don't seem to have a solid basis in reality, and should you try to counter them?
Does that mean just kind of in arguments, or?
I'm unsure. Yeah, maybe talking to other people or in writing, or.
Well, as I said, I mean, these things are really deep. They come back, as Val was talking about, to the founding of Ogden, which, and the coming of the railroad, especially, that really set Ogden on this different historical path, and really shaped people's perceptions of the city, which I think you see kind of continuing to this day. And in the book, I compare that with, kind of interestingly, I had this little case study of Park City, which kind of was similar to Ogden up to about the 1950s, when Park City really changed its path and became this, very, very frou-frou skiing area, while Ogden did not do that and remained a working class place. And I argue that even though the huge demographic shifts of all the immigrant Latinos coming in the last 20, 30 years is really revolutionary for the city, it's kind of folded into that tradition of it, these working class people and this diversity that didn't really change the reputation very much. So yeah, I mean, it's a big, deep problem, but if you want to throw some numbers at people or some ideas at them, like, well, actually, I mean, one of my big findings is Salt Lake City is seen better than Ogden. It's seen as it has a better reputation, but the crime rates in Salt Lake are way higher than in Ogden. So it's, these kind of these empirical numbers really vary from what people think about these two cities, and other places around the area.
Great. We have another question. In what ways do local institutions, planners, politicians, developers contribute to reputations by defining reputations within places, particularly when it comes to areas worthy of growth and development, investment, and those not worthy? How much impact do institutions have on narratives and sub-narratives of places?
Wow. Okay. Well, I guess my big answer to that would be I think a lot of the scholarship focuses on elite voices and elites kind of coming down. But what I found, and my focus was really on what kind of the average person thinks, and what people think. And I found that also just that the elite voices in Ogden were kind of reflections of that the people, the city leaders, as I call them, which are a group of governments and kind of, they're also promotional kind of tourist groups, are looking to kind of form this kind of almost literally whitewashed kind of view of Ogden as a tourist place, as for retirees, or as a college town or something like that. But this kind of reflects the views of most residents, at least the native residents, right? Kind of the immigrant residents are kind of ignored kind of all around by people. So it's it's tough. I don't know. I mean, maybe the panelists have, you know, I'm not that much into, I think this is more an urban planning or something question, but, or about that. I don't know if Andrew or Krista, if you want to jump in here and talk a little bit about that.
I mean, I guess what I would add is that I'm routinely struck by, as I said in my comments, you know, whether those leaders, their visions are sort of out of touch, but after reading your book, I find them sort of willfully out of touch, right? In that they are aspirational in a particular kind of way, right? In that they seem to be seeking a particularly whiter, more affluent version of Ogden. And if we just, you know, kind of put that out into the universe, right, then it will be so. And one of the things that I find so interesting about those efforts, not only in Ogden, but elsewhere, is that they are so limited in their potential, right? So we often think, you know, these are people who have, structurally they have power, right? But culturally they don't always have power, right? They're not always the ones who are going to be really having the last word in terms of what message sticks and what message doesn't stick, right? You know, your big new marketing campaign can get laughed right out of town, right? So it's, I don't know, I find that an interesting case in sort of the limits of power and official power.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a good point, that the elites are often seen as in charge, but when it comes to reputations, that's like wrangling a wild animal. If you don't say something in line with what the community thinks or people think, you're going to be in trouble. And probably the best example of that is, if you remember from the late 90s, sometime Las Vegas decided that, oh, we're going to be family friendly and bring in Disney and whatnot. And it just completely didn't work. You know, they kind of almost reversed course and said, no, well, let's say what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, you know, and kind of leaned into that negative view, which, by the way, is exactly what I think that Ogden should do, instead of kind of trying to hide and redefine itself. Just kind of lean into its bad reputation and say, yeah, we're bad. Come see what it's like, you know, that kind of thing.
So if I can just pop in here and share, I think that's really a powerful strategy. And in many ways, I'm involved in numerous boards and commissions in the community, none of which I'm representing in this moment. But what I would say is that there is a larger pull toward invigorating that history, the large scale diversity, but transforming what that can look like today versus our previous presumptions and assumptions around identity, class, and culture. But I think that that's still in its infancy in Ogden. But I do see that there is definitely a willingness to embrace the parts of the past that allow everyone else to come forward. But that's not necessarily a loud voice, but it's a growing voice.
Great, thank you. I'd like to move on to the next question. So based on your work in Ogden on place reputations, do you have any suggestions for researchers interested in quantifying the neighborhood reputation concept as we try to understand the role of reputations in perpetuating neighborhood inequalities?
I guess my short answer there is no. I am so not a quantified person, but yeah, I don't know. I mean, my method was kind of let people kind of babble on about the city and then find patterns in it. So I don't know. Maybe I hate to do this again, but I don't know. Is there empirical research? I wouldn't know. I'm not all that familiar with what's being asked and how it's being studied. So I guess that's my answer there.
Great. So this one is from somebody who moved to Ogden in 2006, and they were told to stay away from downtown Ogden. And this was during the renovation of the LDS Temple on Washington Boulevard. So their question is, how do you think the LDS Temple influenced culture affected the perception of Ogden's reputation back then, and I'm guessing that's 2006, and now in 2020?
You know what? I guess I'm 0 for 2 on these. I really don't know. I don't think, from what I saw in the interviews, people didn't mention the temple very much, and it wasn't kind of seen. I mean, people did mention, oh, it's by the temple or whatever, but that was kind of the extent of it. That it wasn't kind of noted as a big landmark of Ogden, and I'm not sure why. If that's because it sticks out so much, or maybe the opposite, it blends in. That it's kind of seen as, whoa, there's a temple in the middle of, this ghetto area there, but I don't really have a feeling. I don't know if Adrian or Val have any insight they could give on this, on how people see the temple, but I didn't really see anything, and I don't know if I could speak to it from outside of what I found in my interviews either.
I noticed that when the temple was being renovated and then opened for public tours, that there seemed to be somewhat of a Zion curtain between the temple and its southern border on 22nd Street, and further, just a little further away, 25th Street. I thought that we would see people then go on to 25th Street and go to a restaurant or something and give it business, but it just didn't seem to happen. And I am hoping that in connection with this, that the planners will be more creative in finding ways to bring the Mormon community onto 25th Street. Someone opened an ice cream parlor, which I've seen lines out the door there. That's a great way. And then if they could plan concerts at the Ogden Amphitheater that would feature music that would interest the Mormon community, that might be another way to have greater input, both culturally and economically.
So as a native Utahn, I was born in Ogden, raised in Davis County. The temple had always been a marker for me. I sort of knew where I was relative to everything else in Ogden if I had the sightline of the temple. And that particular structure, prior to its renovation, was firmly trapped in the 70s from my young eye. And it also seemed to be trapped in a relationship to people that was exclusive. And so it didn't seem like a place that I could go to, or that people like me could go to explore. The transformation after the renovation was much more of a drawing people in from the community that had not been present in its previous existence, at least from my perspective. And having a father who had grown up in Ogden, it served as a particular anchor, going back to your moral frontier of who was good and worthy and who was less so. And I think that there is less of that connotation today. But I do believe that we will see an increased draw to the larger area because of its renovation. There might be some competition because Layton and I think Syracuse are getting their own temples now, but one of the things that I would hope for would be that we would see, because the number of marriages in that particular location have radically increased, I would hope that there would be receptions or other event opportunities that would be able to leverage that building and its resource to boost the economy on 25th Street or the surrounding community for restaurants, event spaces, etc.
Great.
But I think we're dealing with COVID, so that also has sort of really, tampered things down.
So I think we have time for one more question. So I've got so many to choose from. We had a lot of questions. Maybe briefly go over how Ogden got its reputation as a sin city, and if it was fair and unfair, and to kind of discuss that a little bit.
Okay.
I can speak to that.
Yeah. I was gonna...
A lot of it was because of 25th Street. And in 1889, when the Liberal Party, which consisted of non-Mormons, finally won the mayor's office and the city council, they took over. And after that, not only the Mormon community of Ogden, but Salt Lake began to criticize Ogden and 25th Street for its moral degeneracy. It really was not that valid because Salt Lake had as much or more, and yet they used it as a battering ram to criticize Ogden. And there are still reverberations of that today, that bad rap, which is really not deserved.
If I can add to that, in my estimation, it takes 30 minutes to drive from Ogden to Salt Lake, but from Salt Lake to Ogden is a day-long journey on a horseback. And that also sort of creates the sense that it's less cultured, it's less lively, engaging. There's not necessarily a place for you if you're not already in that area.
Yeah, and I guess to kind of sum up, I think a big part of this is the kind of the moral values of the region and the moral standards, and how Ogden, from the time the railroad came in, was breaking that rule. It was worldly. It was what's the LDS saying, of the world, or that versus in the world or something. Sorry, I may be offending people there, but it was very worldly. You know, you had a lot of diversity, you had a lot of, and with that, different cultural standards and ways of doing things. And so I think that has rubbed against the city and the wrong way, kind of historically. And also that I was talking about the transformation from 1950 of Park City, where Ogden didn't have that, where in Park City, the silver mining went out and they decided on a different path. Ogden kind of didn't. They just kind of faltered and were like, oh crap, what are we going to do? And so what you had is kind of, things did go downhill. There was a lot of problems, you know, with the economy falling out and their major institution falling out, which I think you continue to see at least into the 90s, if not farther today. You can still see buildings, you know, there was a building downtown that was having problems because pieces of it were falling out, falling down in front of the train station there. And so you do still have recovery happening, and things are changing with people are moving in, you know, now especially housing values are going up and those kind of things. So there is transformation happening. And I think people, as Adrian was saying, there are a group of people who are interested in transforming the idea of Ogden and changing things. But this stigma is kind of still attached itself throughout this, you know, 150 or so years.
Great, thank you everybody so much. We had so many good questions, and I apologize if we didn't get to your question. Feel free to email it to me and I can probably pass it on to Pepper. I'd like to thank everyone for participating. I appreciate you taking the time every day for attending the event.
Yes, thank you all so very much.
Congratulations, Pepper.
Thanks, Andrew.
Everyone get the book. It's very readable.
Thanks, Adrian.
And you can purchase the book from our website, uofupress.com.